Hello and welcome back. My name is Mitchell Pearson. In this video, we're going to take a look at creating secure connections in Azure with Azure Data Factory and Azure Synapse. Specifically, creating secure connections over to our Azure SQL database, creating secure connections over to our Azure Blob Storage accounts. And so if you like these types of videos on Azure Data Factory, on DAX, Power BI, Power Apps, make sure to take this moment, hit that like and subscribe button down below. And if there are specific videos that you're interested in, let me know in the comments. Tell me what you're interested in. I'm always looking for some inspiration for future YouTube videos as well. So today we're going to be specifically looking at managed virtual networks inside of Azure Data Factory and then private endpoints. And what this does, just as a very quick kind of high level understanding, is it gives you a way of creating a secure connection between Data Factory and the different data stores that you connect to. The inspiration behind this video is recently I was doing a 3-hour introduction to Azure video on the Pragmatic Works YouTube channel. So you can go back and take a look at that. And one of the questions I got from the thousands of people who were on that live stream was, how can I securely connect from Azure Data Factory to my Azure SQL database? Because there's other ways of being able to create a connection here. You can allow Azure services to be turned on. You can try to go through and add the IP address that is being used to connect. But those are really not going to solve the problem of trying to create a secure connection to make sure that all of that data is transferred on the backbone of Microsoft and it is secured and it's moved securely, right? So one of the things, and let me just full transparency here, I am not a networking expert. I'm not a networking guru. I've used virtual networks in Azure quite a bit between my virtual machines and my different resources to lock those down. And there's a lot of work that goes into that. So what we're talking about today is virtual networks, yes, but specifically managed virtual networks within Azure Data Factory. And these managed virtual networks take away a lot of the decision making and a lot of the overhead administration that you might have to do if you were managing the virtual networks yourself. So we're talking about managed virtual networks within Azure Data Factory. This is really cool. Now, we also are going to be taking a look at Synapse Analytics because it's a little bit different in the original setup and configuration than what it is here. Once you got it set up, good to go. But there is something that we need to take a look at in Azure Synapse. In fact, in many of my videos going forward on Data Factory, pipelines, data sets, data flows, I'll be doing those probably in the Synapse interface instead of in the Data Factory one, because I think long-term that's where everything is going. So let's take a look at the problem that we're talking about here, right? I am inside of Azure Data Factory right now. And if I go over to the Manage ribbon over here, and I open up one of my SQL connections, so I'm going to open up this guy right here, Azure SQL to an AdventureWorks database that I have, you'll notice that I am creating a connection here to my pw mitchellpearson.database.windows.net. And I'm connecting to my AdventureWorks database. So I'm connecting to that SQL server and I'm connecting to that database. I put in my username and password and I come down to the bottom and I test connection and I'm going to get a failure. This is very common. You run into this a lot when you first start with Data Factory. And if you look at the option here, it's going to give us an error message that essentially says, look, we cannot connect to that server because either your username is incorrect or down here, I cannot open the server. It's essentially a firewall issue. And this is your first line of defense when you're working in Azure, right? We want to put firewall rules in place to say, look, if you're at some coffee shop, you're at Starbucks and you're drinking coffee and you're hanging out there and you accidentally leave your computer open, somebody can't just log into or try to authenticate to our Azure service, because guess what? We don't allow those random IP addresses to have a way to connect to our Azure SQL database. And so that's what this is. We're trying to create a connection to Azure SQL database. Azure Data Factory is like, nope, not, Azure SQL database from Azure Data Factory, and Azure SQL database says, no, we're not going to have any of that, so I cannot connect. Now, how do we fix this without managed virtual networks, without private endpoints? Little less secure, right? How do we fix it? Well, either A, we can take this IP address and we can add it to the firewall rule of that SQL Server database. Or B, we can turn on allow Azure services across all of Azure. So let's go take a look at that real quick, and I'm going to talk about both of those, why we won't do them very quickly, briefly here, and then we're going to jump straight into setting up the managed virtual network. But I want to make sure I'm explaining the background behind this a little bit, because most people watching this, probably this is a little bit brand new to you, and you probably need to understand the why behind why am I going to use a virtual network that's managed by Microsoft. So we're going to go back over to my YouTube channel, my YouTube resource group, and let's open up our server, which is right there. There we go. We'll open up our server, and in our server, we're going to go take a look at firewalls and virtual networks, all right? So I'm in my PW Mitchell Pearson, so PW stands for Pragmatic Works, Mitchell Pearson SQL Server, and then down here I have my firewalls and my virtual networks. And so what we're going to do here, make sure I'm not in the way on the screen, is we can come in here and we can add an IP address. We can create a rule that says that IP address that's trying to authenticate from Azure Data Factory, they can authenticate, it's okay. And so I could put in that IP address that we saw just a moment ago. The problem with that is that is a dynamic IP address that changes every time Azure Data Factory tries to authenticate to my SQL Server. So if I put it in right now, yeah, it might work for that one test connection, but later on it's not going to work. So that's not a good option here. The better option, if you want to make sure that connection always works, is you come up here and you turn on Allow Azure Services and Resources to access this server. And that will work. And that's what a lot of people do. They come in here and they turn that on, and they think everything is right with the world. However, what does this mean? This means that any Azure resource anywhere in the world for any tenant, any organization can connect to your SQL database. They can get through that first line of defense and they can try to authenticate. So if I were on a virtual machine right now and you have this enabled on your server at some other company, at company XYZ, and I'm on a VM within the Azure network, I could try to open up Management Studio and connect to your SQL database. I could just start typing in username and passwords and hope that I get lucky. Obviously, more sophisticated hackers have a better program than that, but that is what this means. And so for a lot of companies, they're like, look, we cannot turn on Allow Azure Services to all Azure services. That's not a good option. So adding the IP address is not a good option. Turning on Azure Services, when we're talking about in production, we have federal regulations, we have security risk, right? We have, lawsuits can be brought against us if our data gets leaked out. This is not a good option. Then what do we do? Well, short of letting somebody who knows networking backward, not me, somebody who really knows networking backward and forward, setting up all this stuff and managing it, we can take advantage of managed virtual networks and locking all of this down. This is awesome, and it's really easy to set up and configure. So that's kind of the background here on what we're doing. Let's jump in now and take a look at this. So we're going to go back over to Azure Data Factory. And what we want to do, you noticed right there, the connection doesn't work. It's going to work here in a little bit. There's a couple of steps we need to do. One, we need to create an integration runtime in Azure Data Factory that is ran inside of a managed virtual network. That's one. Secondly, we then need to come over here and create a managed private endpoint for that virtual network. So we create essentially a private IP address. That's two. Create the integration runtime, add the private endpoint. Number three is we need to go over and approve it. So we go over to our private link center and we approve that because it will be sitting in a pending state. Once approved, we can now create connections using that, and it's going to be awesome. So let's walk through this process together. When we're done at the end, we're going to transition over to Azure Synapse, and I'm going to show you a slight little difference there as well. So the first thing that I want to do is we need to go ahead and create an integration runtime. Now, if you've worked with Data Factory before, you know probably what an integration runtime is, and it is essentially the compute, the resources in the background that is used to move the data between different data stores. So if you're moving data from a blob storage account over to Azure SQL database, there's some resources that need to be used, memory, CPU, so on and so forth, and your integration runtime is what moves that, and this is how you get billed primarily in Data Factory. So we need to create an integration runtime where that compute is running in a managed virtual network. So we're going to do a new integration runtime here. And then we're going to choose Azure/self-hosted because it's going to be one of those. It's not an SSIS lift and shift scenario. So we'll do Azure self-hosted and click continue. And then we're going to grab Azure and click continue again, which by the way continues being blocked by me, so we'll go ahead and get rid of that. We'll click continue again, and then we just need to give this integration runtime a name. So we'll call this our Azure IR, and then I'm going to call it, managed VNet, right? So I'll give it a name here. That makes sense so that when I am in there and I am creating my connections, that I make sure that I'm using this integration runtime and not the default. Now there's another thing I want to talk about around this default. I'm going to hold that till later in the video as well. We'll come back to that. So for now, we're going to choose the managed VNet. How do we turn this on? How do we create this within a managed VNet? Well, that is right here. So where it says virtual network configuration, we're going to turn this on to enable. And by clicking that button, it's essentially taking this integration runtime and putting it into a managed virtual network that Microsoft manages. So we don't have to worry about setting up the subnets. We don't have to worry about turning on certain service endpoints or any of that. This is going to be managed for us automatically. So we're going to enable that, and then we're going to turn on this option right here, which says enable interactive authoring capability after creation. What does this mean? Well, what it means is exactly what you see right there. Whenever you are testing your connection to your linked services, whenever you're browsing a folder, whenever you're setting up a data set, whenever you're previewing data, importing a parameter, or doing any of those things, because we're using an integration runtime within a managed virtual network, there's a little bit of, there's compute that's assigned to that. And so what this says is, look, if you want that to be more efficient and happen quicker, you want to go ahead and enable interactive authoring. And so what that means is that Microsoft will essentially provision compute for you so that when you're developing and you click on the preview button or you browse or you test connection, it happens a lot faster than waiting for those resources to be provisioned so you can then do that. It's very, very similar to data flow debug. Remember when you're working in data flows, and I've done some videos on this, when you're working in data flows, you will enable the data flow debug capability. And what data flow debug does is it spins up a Databricks cluster in the background so that when you're doing things like previewing data in data flows, you don't have to wait 5 or 6 minutes for a cluster to be provisioned. That's kind of what this is doing here. And it has a time to live or an automatic termination of about 60 minutes. So once you get in here and you start doing work, it will automatically provision some compute in the background that you can work with, making development a lot faster, a lot cleaner, a lot easier. And then within 60 minutes, it'll automatically deprovision that and get rid of it so you're not having to worry about that. That's what that means. So yeah, there we go. The next thing I want to do is go ahead and choose a region. Everything I do is always in the East US too, so it keeps it very simple. And then there is another option here around data flow runtime. I have done a YouTube video on this, really on optimization of debugging. So when you're in development, how can you reduce cost? And I showed how to create an integration runtime specifically with kind of limited resources around the data flow runtime and your integration. But I'm not going to worry about that here. So that's another topic for another day. Now, this is it. Once we have done this and we click create, what's going to happen is it's going to go through and create that integration runtime. It's going to create it with that managed virtual network as you see right here. So if we zoom in, you'll notice that we have a managed virtual network. That's what this IR does, which is awesome. So the IR has been created here. It looks like it is now running, which is perfect, but we're not done. So now, once you create that managed private virtual network or that managed virtual network through Azure Data Factory, this is really easy. The next thing we need to do is we have to go over to our managed private endpoints, and we need to create a private endpoint that allows us to connect Azure Data Factory to Azure SQL database, Azure SQL Server, right? So what we'll do is in here, we're going to create a new one that's going to open over here on the right, and we're going to choose from that list Azure SQL database. So we're going to be creating a private endpoint, private IP connection to Azure SQL database here. So we'll do that. Then we need to go ahead and give this a name. So I'll do something like, if you've ever seen me name a resource in Azure Data Factory before, I like to tell it what kind of data store is it? Like, is it on-prem or is it in Azure? It is SQL, and then the name of the database we'll connect to here will be AdventureWorks DW, and that's fine. So we've gotten that done. We then need to connect to the actual database here. So we're going to choose our server, and then my server for this one here is PW Mitchell Pearson, all right? And then down here at the very bottom, once we've done that, we'll go down to the very bottom here and click create. After creation, a private endpoint request will be generated. This is where a lot of people get tripped up here. A request will be generated that must get approved. There's two different places you can go to approve this. I'm going to show you both of them. All right, so we're going to go ahead and click create. So creating the managed IP, remember that, or creating the managed private endpoint here, remember that was step 2. Step 1, create a new integration runtime within a managed virtual network. Step 2, create the managed private endpoint. Step 3, once it's provisioned, we have to approve it. All right, so we're going to let that finish up. This could take a few seconds, and I'll come back here in about, all right, I'm back. So you notice that it says the approval state is pending. And what that means is that it needs to be approved. And so we can approve this in a couple of different places. Obviously, within your Azure service, you need to have the right level of permission to do this. So it might have to be somebody else who approves these private endpoints for you. But what we're going to do is back in Azure, we can either go to the private link center, because we're creating a private link essentially between these two resources, or we can go directly to the server that we just connected to. So let's go to the private link server first. So I'll go back over to, let's just go to all services here. I'm going to search for private link. All right, we'll go into the private link server, and then you'll see under active connections, is it approved already? It shouldn't be approved. Let's click on that right there. Then go back. I'm thinking there's some residual from when I did this before. So let's go back into the private link center. Private endpoint, yep, it shouldn't show up here. There it is, pending connections. All right, pending connections, sorry about that. I went directly to active connections. So pending connections is where you can go and select it, and then you can either approve or you can reject it, right? So this is where you can approve it. Now you can go to the private link center and do it, and this is great because you can see all of your private endpoints across all of your resources. So this is a great resource and a great place to go. However, you could optionally, I'm not going to do anything here, so I'm not going to approve it or reject it. Optionally, what we could have done is back in our YouTube resource group right here, I can go in and go over to our server, and then on our server right here, you'll notice that we can go over to our private endpoint connections, and right here, I can select it and I can approve it. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to approve that connection real quick. I don't want to give it any kind of response. And that might take a moment or so for that connection. So thanks to the magic of video editing, we're going to pause it for just a moment, and I'll pop back in here in just a second. All right, and I'm back. It says that the connection has now been successfully approved. So we can go back over to Azure Data Factory, and we can try to refresh this. Now, if I remember correctly, it might take up to a minute to show up here, but let's go ahead and refresh. And it is going to take us a moment. Let's do this. I want to create another connection. So this shows you how to create a connection to Azure SQL Database. What about creating a private endpoint to our blob storage account? So while we're waiting for that to finish, we're going to create one more very quickly here over to Azure Blob Storage. And so I'll click on Continue, and I'll give this a name real quick. This will be Azure Blob, and then my blob storage account here is just named Mitchell Pearson. And then I'll grab my Mitchell Pearson storage account and click on Create. So we are creating a managed, once again, and we'll click refresh here to see if that one's approved yet, and it's not. We're now creating another private endpoint. And so here's the thing to keep in mind with these private endpoints. If you have 10 different services you're connecting to, Azure Cosmos DB, Azure SQL Database, Azure Blob, you're creating an endpoint for each one of those here that need to be approved. But now, once both of these have been approved from the private link center or from those individual resources, once they have both been approved, we will now be able to create, essentially in Data Factory, we can create linked connections, essentially connection managers, link services between those resources, and everything is done on the backbone of Microsoft using private IP addresses, locked down and secure. So that's what we're going for here. So we'll refresh it. It looks like this one's still pending. That one is still provisioning. And so what I want to do is, before I pause the video here, I want to go over to the blob storage account. So let's go over there first. We'll go back to our blob storage account. And in your storage account, you can also approve those private endpoints just like we did with the SQL Server. And where we go for that is we're going to go down to networking. There it is. We'll go over here to where it says networking, right over here on the left. And then we'll look at our private endpoint connections. And when I go in there, you'll notice that we have one right here that has been provisioned and it says it's pending. So we're going to click on approve and then we'll click yes. And so now this is a really good point for me to kind of pause the video, let that finish, let all the approvals go through. Then we'll come back and take a look at what those connections look like because we're not quite done because we have to create the connections. And when you create the connections, you have to remember to use the right integration runtime. So we'll be back in just a second. So we're back. Both of our connections have been approved. We are almost done with this video. We now need to go ahead and create our link services, and they have to use the integration runtime that's tied to the virtual network that's tied to these private endpoints. There's a lot there, right? So let's do that real quick. We'll go over to our link services. Remember before we were trying to create a connection. If we look at one that already exists, so if I'm not going too quickly here, we had a connection here that we were using before right here. And remember, we couldn't connect. So I've done all the hard work, right? Well, if I go in there and I open that up and I come down here and test connection, it's going to work, right? Of course it's going to work because we just did all that work. And then you look in here and you're like, wait a minute, Mitchell, that's not working. We're getting the exact same error message that we were getting before. It's not working. So what's going on? So the problem is that it's not that our virtual network isn't working, it's that we're not using the correct integration runtime. We're using the automatically created integration runtime that got created when we first created this Azure Data Factory. So that's not what we want. All right, so what do we do? Well, there's a couple of options here, and this is what I said we'll talk about later. One is we need to go ahead and just switch this over to the virtual network we just created, right? So it says interactive authoring is enabled, so you can look more into that later. Everything here still looks like it's connected correctly. So now we come down to the bottom, test connection, and boom, it works. This is awesome. This is great. It works. So there's a couple things here, right? We got to make sure we use the right integration runtime. Here's the thing. Let's say that you're looking at this, and I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of here. If I go back over to integration runtimes, it's going to be very easy for a developer to accidentally keep grabbing this one, especially new developers. And then you're like, oh, what happened? Fortunately, when you are provisioning your Azure Synapse or Azure Data Factory today, you can set it up so that your default integration runtime is in a managed virtual network. This is an older data factory that I've had sitting around here for months and months. So I'm kind of stuck with that integration runtime that's there. And you'll notice that even if I hover over it, you really can't delete it because it's there. So on new data factories, when you provision them, when you create them, you can put the default integration runtime into a virtual network, into a managed virtual network, and then you only have one option here. So that's something that's pretty cool, and you'll see that option under networking. It's right there. It looks exactly like it looked here. Now, here's the thing. This was pretty cool because this was a data factory that started off without a managed virtual network. We created one, and you saw how it worked. And if I created another link service in here, let's take a look at that because we do have some time, and I want to talk about that. How do we create a secure connection to our blob storage account? Well, if we go over to our storage account right here, and we go into networking, and you look at firewalls and virtual networks, most storage accounts by default are open to all networks, meaning all IP addresses. And that is, once again, a security risk because it could be easy for someone to try to authenticate to your storage account and get access to your data. So what we can do is you can turn this off and put this on selected networks only so that it is not all networks. And then instead of adding any kind of firewall rules here or anything like that, what we can do is we'll just use the private endpoints. And so you can also connect to the blob storage account. And by the way, this is a really good time to mention that it is recommended that you use private endpoints to create those secure connections between all of your different resources so that you have the best security that you can have here, right? Not opening up all the IP addresses, not allowing all Azure resources, but you use those private endpoints so that first line of defense is really, really strong, and it's hard for somebody to even get to the point of trying to authenticating. So that is what is there, and I wanted to show you what that looks like here because it's easy for me to always forget that I can manage those IP addresses at the blob storage account level, but we can. Now, we've taken a look at Data Factory. I promised you we would go look at Azure Synapse, and so that's the next part that we're going to do. So back in my YouTube resource group, we are going to go take a look at a Synapse workspace. I just provisioned the Synapse workspace right before we came in to this video, and this is where you're going to see something that's different with Azure Synapse than Data Factory that's very, very important. So let's go ahead and launch the Azure Synapse Studio. Let's launch our workspace here. And when we get in there, I'm going to show you that I actually cannot, the way that it is currently set up and configured, and I just created it today, I cannot create an integration runtime that is in a virtual network. And I'm going to explain to you why, because this is something that you have to decide at the time when you are provisioning. If I go over here and go down to manage, just like we did in Data Factory, and then I go over to integration runtimes right here, you'll notice that this is a public subtype. It's not a managed virtual network, right? So it's a public. If I go in and say, well, let's create a new integration runtime to lock this down and make it secure for all of my pipelines that I'm building in Synapse, I can create a new, click on Azure here, click on continue, and then over here, you'll see that I don't have the ability to enable virtual network configuration. It is disabled. I don't have the ability to do that. So what's going on? Why can't I do it? Is it something I can do in Azure Synapse, or is there something that's wrong? And unfortunately, the reason we can't do this here is because something's wrong. So when you're provisioning a Synapse workspace here, and let's just create a new resource and walk through the basics real quick so I can show this to you. When you are provisioning an Azure Synapse workspace, and we're going to go into create here, and we're probably going to try to skip everything and we'll go to networking. Under networking, you have the ability right here to enable a managed virtual network. And if you read all the text here, you might think that, well, if I don't enable the managed virtual network when I create it, that's okay, I can do it later. In fact, if you read right here, allow connections from all IP addresses to your workspace endpoints, you can restrict this to just Azure data center IP addresses and or specific ranges after creating the workspace. But that has to do with just IP addresses. Choose whether you want Synapse Managed Virtual Network dedicated for your Azure workspace. Well, once again, there's nothing here that really says you can change it afterwards or not, so you might assume you can. But if you click on Learn More, we go to the incredible Microsoft documentation. I say that with all seriousness. I always give Microsoft, when it comes to Azure and Power BI, I give them an incredible amount of just kudos, right? They do a great job keeping this documentation up to date. And you'll notice that if you come in here and you scroll down just a little bit, you cannot change this workspace configuration after the workspace is configured. For example, you cannot reconfigure a workspace that does not have managed workspace virtual network associated with it. So if you create it and it doesn't have a managed virtual network, you cannot add it to that workspace after the fact. Alternatively, you cannot reconfigure a workspace with a managed workspace virtual network associated to it and disassociate it. So if you create it with a virtual network, it's there, it exists, it lives. That's just the way it is. You can't get rid of it. And if you create it without it, you can't add it. I don't know if this is going to change in the future. I just don't know. But what I do know is from reading this definition right here, you want to make sure that when you provision your Azure Synapse, if you're going to be locking this down, which is recommended, and you're managing it yourself, remember, one of the things that we should point out here, this was a rather lengthy video for me, probably going to be closer to that 30-minute time frame. I do a lot of 10-minute videos. One of the things to keep in mind is that you can do a lot of this virtual network stuff yourself. You can manage it yourself. You can create the IP, the private endpoints yourself. You can create the subnets. You can do all of that. There's just a larger learning curve involved in that. That is not an area that I personally feel super comfortable with, even though I have done it, because that's not my background. It's not something I get excited about. I get excited about Power BI. I get excited about DAX, Power Apps, Azure Data Factory, building and developing stuff. I love it. That's why I come up here and I work on the weekends or before work, and I do that kind of stuff because I love learning that stuff. And I do love learning about the networking stuff, but I don't get fired up about it. But it is something I'm going to be spending more time learning because I feel like that's a little bit of a weak point in my armor. So I want to learn it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Give me some comments. If you liked the video, obviously hit that like button. Let me know what you thought about the video, and let me know how I can help you with other videos going forward. Like I said before, I'm always looking for inspiration on these videos. Thank you, and enjoy, and have a good day.